So today's daf in Masechet Chullin, week 2 of Chullin, is daf Yud. Already, daf Yud, how fast we go. So we're starting from 6 lines from the top. I should have done this yesterday, but I stopped because of respecting the daf yomi. But we mentioned yesterday, and we're going to get back to all these discussions today about what is what is considered well, let me put it this way. How do you transition an animal from being usser when it's alive to being mutar to eat once it's been shechted properly? And of course, what chazaka do you use? What assumptions do you use in that process? Before we before we get to today's daf, we have a little bit of piece to do from yesterday's daf, essentially, where we mention the issue of sakana. Right. So sakana, of course, all these halachot of rov and chazaka and halachic principles don't necessarily apply to danger, right? So you can't walk into a subway where 45% of the people are infectious and say, well, I'm going to go with the majority and I won't get an infection, right? So when you get to sakana, it obviously is a whole different category. And we said yesterday the example was mayim migulim. You had liquid that was revealed, that was uncovered, that could have potentially have been poisoned. And so today we read the Mishnah in Trumot. So it says Gemara 6 lines from the top. It's not Hatam. There's a Mishnah in Masechet Trumot that says, Shlosha mashkin asurin mishum giloy. There's three types of liquids that are prohibited if they are left unexposed, or not unexposed. They're left exposed, right? And that is mayim, water, yayin, wine, v'chalav, and milk. And says the Mishnah, Kama Yeshuv Yasurim, how much time do you have to leave them exposed and they become prohibited? Kadeshi Yitzei Harachash Mimakom Karov Yishta. The amount of time it would take a rachash, which Rashi says is uh, a targum of nachash, right? The creepy crawly thing, the snake comes out and can drink it and inject its poison into it. Says the Gemara, well, okay, but that's a very subjective definition. What do you mean makom karo, from a nearby place? Where's a nearby place? The nearest subway station, the nearest wall, the nearest kama makom karov. Amar Yitzchak Breder of Yehuda K'dish Yitzim Tachat Ozen Kli. Makom karov means if it's like a pitcher, it could be hanging, could be hiding like scorpions or snakes will do underneath the lip of the pitcher. So it could be sitting right there. It comes out v'yishtet. Says Gemara, what do you mean v'yishtet? It's drinks. Hakachazile. Then we would see it if it just drank, and you would know if it's there. And what we mean is yishtet v'yachzar lechoro. The amount of time it would take for an animal that was, say, hiding right next to the mug to get out, crawl out, drink, go back into its hole, and you miss the whole thing. What if that's 30 seconds, 2 minutes, whatever it might be? It's probably not 2 minutes. And if you leave your water revealed for that amount of time, you're in trouble. Okay, so again, the Gemara, as you know, was very fanatical about this issue. And it had tremendous implications because they never left their things exposed, and if they did, they would throw them away. But we, of course, live in a different society, I think, so we have different concerns. Anyways, that is
I'm not sure that the snake term is really accurate because I've never heard of snakes drinking. There are other dangerous animals that do.
well, it's not so much drinking; it's that they inject poison, I guess. But I don't. I mean, we use the word
And,
nachash,
mo- and most snakes are not venomous.
right? So again, as I said, clearly this was something that occupied a lot of attention in the people in the Gemara. So it sounds to me like it was probably a real issue, but it's hard for us to relate because, right, we don't have
Mhm.
have this issue. And maybe it was scorpion. They had a lot of scorpions in the desert areas, but who
Mhm.
knows? Who knows? Itmar. Now back to Masechet Chulin. Essentially, says the Gemara of fundamental. And this really, I would say, pay attention because this is as basic as it gets from Masechet Chulin. Says the statement of the Gemara: Hashochet b'sakin v'nimtza peguma. You shecht an animal with a knife. You check your knife before you do shechita. You did everything right. After shechita is over, an hour later, you pick up the knife and you see that the knife has a problem with it. If the knife had this problem before shechita, the shechita would have been puzzle. You checked the knife before shechita, but what you didn't do is check the knife after shechita, right? And so you don't know if this problem in the knife happened during the shechita and therefore it was a puzzle shechita, or if it happened at some point afterwards. So that is the fundamental question. Says Rav Huna, afilu shiber ba'atzamot kol hayom. Even if you use the same knife to crack bones all day long, meaning after you shechted the animal, you butchered the animal and you cut it up and use the same knife, and so the knife could have been broken or armed afterwards. Psula. The animal that you shechted is puzzle because chashinan shema ba'or nifgama. You have to be concerned and maybe the skin, right, of the animal caused the knife to be damaged. So on the way in, when you're doing shechita, you have to first cut through the skin before you get to the trachea, right? And on your way in, when you cut the skin, you damage the knife. By the time you were cutting the trachea, it was damaged, and you use a damaged knife. And since that's a possibility, says Rav Huna, the animal is puzzle. Right, we're about to say in a second. This is what Rav Huna said yesterday, which is that an animal b'chayeha is b'cheskat isur, while the animal's alive, it's usr, and you have to change that chazakah. And here, because it's a suffix, you can't change that chazakah. So that's Rav Huna's opinion. And Rav Chisda says, I disagree completely, Rav Huna. Keshera, I say that this animal is kosher because you checked the knife before you did shchita. Now the knife is puzzle, but shema be'etzem nifkama. You have 20 other opportunities to have damaged this knife, and we're going to see he's going to argue in a minute that they're much more likely to break a knife on a bone than to break a knife on the skin of an animal. And therefore, you assume it happened after the shechita, and during the shechita, the knife was kosher. Huge, huge machloket. So it says in Rabbi Shimon Rav Huna Kishera, Rabbi Shimon Rav Huna Kishmat today. Rav Huna says that it's possible because, like he said yesterday, that an animal b'chayaz b'cheskat isur, and you have to change that chazakah. And if there's any doubt in whether you change the chazakah, you can't use it. Ella Rav Chisda my taima. What's Rav Chisda's rationale? Amar lecha Rav Chisda would tell you, look, we know you use this knife to cut a bone, and etzem vade pogem, right? A bone certainly causes damage to a knife. There's no doubt that a bone can cause damage. And our suffix pogem, suffix lo pogem, skin is sometimes can cause damage, but it's actually a pretty uncommon occurrence. Havi suffix vivadai, vein suffix motzi videi vadai. It's a suffix that maybe the knife was damaged from the skin of the animal. Vadai that the knife could be damaged from the bones of the animal, and you go with the vadai over the suffix. So that's the machloket, Rav Huna, and Rav Chisda. Miriam, we are exactly in the middle of the daf, Mativ Rava, but I'm sorry, but I'll repeat it because it's super important. We're not going to get to today's daf without what I just said. The question that we raised, and again, it's super fundamental, is that a person took a knife, they checked the knife before they did shechita, everything looks good. They shechted the animal, they continued using the knife for, let's say, the next hour, and then they check the knife and it's puzzle. It has a nick in it, has a break in it. And the question is, did that happen after the shechita or during the shechita? So Rav Chisda says, I'm sorry, Rav Huna says, the animal is puzzle because you have to assume that it's possible that the knife was broken in the process of shechita, meaning by the skin of the animal on the way into the trachea. And by the time you got to the trachea, the knife was puzzle, and therefore the shechita was not good. And the reason Rav Huna says that is because there's a chazaka that when the animal's alive, it's aser. Until you can show for sure that everything was done well, you can't change that chazaka. Rav Chisda says, I disagree. I'm sorry, I keep saying the wrong names. Rav Chisda is correct. Rav Chisda disagrees. Rav Chisda says, look, you use this knife after the shechita to cut the bones of the animal, and that's for sure something that damages knives. The skin of the animal is a very unlikely thing to damage a knife. Go with the vadai over the safek and assume that this knife was damaged after the shechita, and that at the time of shechita, it was a perfectly kosher knife, and you can eat the animal. Okay, so that is the machloket Rav Huna and Rav Chisda. Says the Gemara midway through Daf Yud, Mativ Rava l'siyel Rav Huna. Rava brought a question that proves Rav Huna's point from a Braita. The Braita says very similar kind of case, and this is really when you get into the whole question of chazaka and things like that, these cases overlap a lot. And this is a case of going to the mikvah. The person is tameh, and he is tavfal. He goes to the mikvah, v'Allah, and he comes out of the mikvah, and then later in the day, let's just say, nimsa alav davar chotzetz. He finds a chatzitza on his body, right? Let's say he finds, I don't know, paint on his leg, right? Which would be a chatzitza between him and the mikvah. He wouldn't have gone to the mikvah. Says the Braita, afal pishnit asek boto amin kol hayom kulo. Even if he's a painter and he's been painting all day long, and you say maybe he got the paint on himself after the mikvah, lo alta lo tefillah. The tefillah does not count for him. Ad yomar bari li shlo haya alai kodem lechem. Unless he can say, I am confident, I am certain that I didn't have this chatzitza on me when I went to the mikvah. Says Rava, this seems to prove Rav Huna, because in this case, hacha vade taval, right? This guy definitely walked into the mikvah and came out of it dripping wet. Safik havi aleh, safik lo havi aleh. It was uncertain whether or not he had a chatzitza or he didn't have a chatzitza, right? There's no way for us to know because he didn't check immediately after he went to the mikvah. So the chatzitza that we found 5 hours later might have been there at the time of the mikvah. It might not have been there. And clearly the Braita says, Ka'ati safek u'motzimi de vadai, that the safek is strong enough to go against the vadai tefillah and to show that it raised doubt in it. So here too, it's the same thing. You have a knife. It's a safek if it got damaged before the shechita or during or after the shechita. You definitely did a shechita, but so what? The knife safek is enough to be our error to ruin the chazakah of the shechita. Says Rav Chisda, or the Gemara in the name of Rav Chisda, no, that's very different. Kashani Hatam, there, when you're talking about Tuma and Tahara, and a person going to the mikvah, you should say, look, this person was Tameh when he woke up this morning. To assign the person's standing status, which is the Chazakah, Ve'ema lo Tava. And you say, we don't know if he went to the mikvah or not. We know he was Tameh. He dropped in the water, but dropping in the water is only kosher if you don't have a chatzitza. We don't know if this person had a chatzitza, and therefore, because he was vade tamei and maybe taval, you can't get rid of the tuma from this maybe tefillah. Says, well, it's the same issue here, right? Where am I? Hachanami. Why don't you say the exact same thing by the animal? Hamed behema cheskata. The animal, when it was alive, was puzzle. You know the animal was puzzle. You have a suffix whether the shechita happened or not, right? Because the knife is maybe good and maybe not good. Why don't you say ema lo nishchata? Say maybe it wasn't shechted. You can't say that because it is shechted. Harish chuta lefanech. What do you mean maybe it wasn't shechted? We watched the guy shecht the animal. So he shechted the animal. The problem is with the knife. Says Mar Hachanami Harei Taval Lefanecha. This person went into the mikvah. So what do you mean? Maybe he didn't go to the mikvah. I watched him go in and dunk, and he's wet. Ha ityalda uta. A question in the tefillah happened, so maybe he didn't. Hachanami ityalda uta in the shechita answers the Gemara the fundamental answer, which is that there's a big difference between the case of the shechita and the case of the mikvah. And the difference is that in the case of the shechita, everybody agrees that the shechita was done properly, right? The shochet was experienced, he was observed. The question was whether the knife was a problem. The knife is essentially a third party, right? You have an animal, which has a chazaka, you have a shechita act, you have a knife. Here, sakin itra'ai, behema lo itra'ai. Says Rav Chisda, the reason I think it's different is that here it's the knife that was questioned, not the animal, right? And not the shechita, sorry. And so therefore, you don't view it the same way as the mikvah. With the mikvah, if the person has a chatzitza, he didn't do a tefillah, right? So the question with the mikvah is the person was tameh, he may have gone into the mikvah or may not have gone into the mikvah. So there's a suffix in whether he fixed himself. Here, you have an animal that's not kosher. You did a shechita. Everybody agrees you did a shechita. The question is, was the knife that you used in the shechita a kosher knife or not? But because you established that you definitely did the shechita, that's enough, according to Rav Chisda, to change the chazaka, make it into essentially a kosher animal. Now there's a doubt about the knife, but the knife doubt is not going to change the kashrut of the animal. That's Rav Chisda's opinion. And what I just explained is Rashi's pshat, and this toast is a whole different pshat. But that's the simple pshat.
I have a question, something that might make them also an additional reason they might not be compatible. Uh, Zero chassitzes, isn't that a rabbinic stringency? Whereas a
Not I mean, it's complicated. Remember, there's a whole discussion. But if it's a rove, remember, only a miyah. Remember, chatzitza, if it's a small amount, is rabbinic. But I think if it's a rove or if it's something that you're makpid on, remember?
yeah, if it's rove, it's clearly deraita. But
Right.
if I remember, a small enough one would be rabbinic.
It depends. So remember, there's a difference in whether it's mute and you're makpid or you're not makpid, right? So if it's something that really bothers you that you wouldn't want to be there, it's a problem.
Mm.
So I don't recall. I don't know mikvahot well enough to remember, but um,
All right, we'll do that this time next year.
okay, God willing. Continues the Gemara. So that's the machloket between Rav Chisda and Rav Huna. Meitve. Now says the Gemara, I got a question from the following Braita that we're going to have later on. So now this Braita is referring to actually a bird. Everything I've talked about so far, yesterday we talked a little bit about shechita, about the two simanim of an animal. You have to shecht both of them. When you shecht the bird, you in fact don't need to shecht both simanim. You only need to cut through one of them, right, in order for it to be a shechita. So, but you have to do it properly. And remember that one of the prohibitions that we talked about, one of the problems with shechita, what we talked about yesterday was akara, right? Where you basically instead of cutting through instead of cutting through the siman, you basically ripped it, or the knife pulled it away from its connection, and it was disconnected instead of being cut through. Okay, so that would be a treifa, right? Not a kosher shechita. So says the Breita later, shachat et haveshet. Okay, let's say you're shechting a bird and you shech through one siman, right? So you shech through the veshet, which is the I always forget which one's which. The veshet is the esophagus, right? So you shech through the veshet, and acher kach nishmita gargaret, and then the gargaret, which is the trachea, gets disconnected. So meaning you didn't cut through the gargaret, you pulled it away. But that by a bird is kshira because you only need to do one siman, and you did the first siman properly. In this case, it was the esophagus, and therefore you're fine. Nishmita gargaret. Now, if let's say the trachea got dislodged from your knife before you did any cutting, v'achar kach shacharet haveshet, and then you shechted and cut through the esophagus, then it's psula because the order first you discharged it, dislodged it, and that's puzzle. So that's the bright. That's straightforward. What if you shech the veshet, shacharet haveshet, and by the time you get to the second siman, nimseta gargaret shmuta, you find that the gargaret was disconnected. The Yudea, says the Gemara later, the Breita later, im kodem shchita nishmita, im lachar shchita nishmita. You don't know when it got disconnected. And so clearly it's a huge difference, right? If you shechted one siman and then the other one got disconnected, it's kosher in a bird. If it got disconnected first and then you shechted, it's puzzle. And here you don't know. You did shchita of one, you found the other one disconnected, you don't know when that happened. Says the Breita, the Tosefta later, zeh hayam ma'aseh, this was a story that happened, and they came to the rabbis, and they said, Kol safek shchita pasul. It's a suffix whether you did shchita properly, and therefore it's pasul. Now, obviously, they added this clause, all suffix shchita. So says the Gemara, what is kol suffix shchita? Latuyimai. What are you adding by saying not that this case is pasul, but every case of suffix is pasul? What are you adding? It must be to add the case like Rav Huna and Rav Chisda's disagreement. My love, la tuye ki hai gavna. It's to include a case like our disagreement here, where you did the shechita with the kosher with a knife that you checked before. You didn't check after, so you have a suffix whether you use the knife properly, and the bright is saying it's pasul. Says Rav Chisda, no, not necessarily. Lo, it's la'atuye suffix shaha, suffix daras. It could be referring to the case where you don't know. Remember all the other psulim of shchita, shihiyah, which means you wait a long time, daras, which means you put pressure instead of cutting. Maybe in those cases where you're not sure, right? You waited during the shchita, you can't recall how long you waited. Maybe it's adding that anytime you have an uncertainty about a fundamental act of shchita, it's possible. But this case, right? Might be different. Says the Gemara on the top of Daf Yud Amabet, just to remind you, Umaishna. Now, what's the difference between a suffix in Shihiyah or a suffix in this case? And it's exactly what Rav Chisda said before. Because Hatam, in that case, later on, where there's a suffix whether you disconnected the windpipe, there's a suffix whether you were Shihiyah or Drisa, Itialda Bereuta Bebehema. There, the question is in something that happened in the animal, right? In this act of Shchita. Hacha here, sakin itrai. Here the question is the knife, behema lo itrai, but the animal and the act of shechita in the animal is of no doubt. Everyone agreed that that happened properly, and therefore, according to Rav Chisda, it's a very different situation. And so this is basically the machloket between Rav Chisda and Rav Huna, which is everyone agrees that when there's a doubt in the act of shechita, you have to go safek l'chumra. But if there's a doubt in some other aspect, in this case the knife, that's the machloket. Says the Gemara at the top of Daf Yudam Abet, third line, Hilchata Kavadeit Rav Huna. In fact, the halacha is like Rav Huna, that it's pasul, Kishelo Shiber Ba'etzem. If you didn't use the knife to break bones afterwards, meaning you just use the knife, maybe you used it to cut other meat, you used it to cut your vegetables, but you didn't use it for bones, then the halacha is that you have to assume the knife got pasul in the beginning, right? But the halacha is kavatei Rav Chisda kishashibra ba'etzem. If you broke a bone with it after the shchita, since a bone is so much more likely to damage a knife than shchita, you assume that the halacha is like Rav Chisda in that case. Now, it says the Gemara, one second. Rav Chisda's whole rationale was that it was because you were breaking bones. So what do you mean the halacha is like Rav Chisda if you broke a bone? That's all Rav Chisda said. What you're implying is, Michlal, fifth line, Rav Chisda afagav lo shibur ba'etzem. The Rav Chisda is saying it's kosher even if you didn't break bones with the knife, right? If that's the meaning, because you're saying halacha is like Rav Chisda, but only if you broke bones. But that's all Rav Chisda said. You're making it sound like Rav Chisda says this shechita is kosher. The fact that the knife was found to be pasul 2 hours later is not a problem, right? Even if you didn't break bones with it. So it doesn't matter if you didn't break bones with it, I'll be my ifka. How did the knife get ruined if you didn't use it? Ema says the Gemara, it's possible Be'etzem demafreket ifkum. If Chisda is possibly saying, look, when you shecht an animal, you cut through the skin in the neck of the animal, right? And that's where Rav Huna says the knife might have gotten ruined, which is unlikely. You then cut through the simanim, but behind the trachea of the animal is the spine, right? And your knife goes up against the bones, and that's where your knife probably got ruined, which is after the act of shechita. So says Rav Chisda, there's always a case of breaking bones, and we're not, when the Gemara says we don't pass like Rav Chisda in that case, that already is too far, right? If you weren't separately cutting bones, then we don't assume that the knife got broken at some other point. But Rav Chisda himself might say that no matter what, there's always a concern, even if you don't know that you hit the bone, right? Because you don't have to cut the bone to do shechita. But even if you don't know if you hit the bone, it's there. And there's always a risk that that's where the knife got ruined. And so Rav Chisda seems to be adopting an opinion that really is very expansive, laheter, that you can always assume that what happened to the knife happened after the shechita. We're saying, we paskin like Rav Huna, if you didn't have an act that's very likely to break the knife, but we paskin like Rav Chisda if you were engaged in cutting up a lot of bones after the shechita. So that is a very fundamental machloket, and it's a very tricky thing. Rashi seems to go very strongly like Rav Huna, although the Gemara here is sort of hedging about when we paskin like which one. Says the Gemara, Havi Uvda. Now, in fact, there was a case, right, where basically this exact thing happened. The shochet looked at the knife, they checked it, it was good, they did shechita. 2 hours later, they checked the knife, and it's bad. And the question is, what about all the animals that were shechted? So, and what happened in the case, Taraf Rav Yosef atleitar chiyuta. Rav Yosef made treif, right? This is a use of word treif, right, for a bad shechita. 13 animals. So this was probably the most expensive day ever, right? They slaughtered and slaughtered and slaughtered. They didn't check the knife again, which was obviously a big mistake. At the end of the day, the knife was puzzle, and Rav Yosef said all 13 animals are puzzle. So Rav Yosef was taraf 13 animals. Says Mar Kaman, that must be like Rav Huna, right? Is it going like Rav Huna? And meaning afilu kamaita, even the first animal of the day. Remember that you check the knife before the first animal. You then shechted 13 animals, check the knife again, and it's puzzle. So maybe Rav Yosef is passing like Rav Huna that every animal is puzzle, including the first one, because you have to assume that maybe the knife broke on the way into the first one. And it's going, not necessarily. It could be lo Rav Chisda. It could be that Rav Yosef is in fact passing like Rav Chisda, but he's saying lebar mikamaita, right? The first one is kosher because the knife was kosher before the first one. But every other animal, because you didn't check it, you have to assume maybe the knife got damaged on its way out of the first animal. And so every other animal is puzzle. It says, but it's possible that Rav Chisda takes this even further. That la'olam, he's going like Rav Huna, because Rav Chisda, maybe Rav Chisda would say that all the animals were kosher. Michti, or all of them except for the last, right? Michti, maybe, or sorry, all of them. Because Rav Chisda is saying, mitla talina. Look, we're allowed to be very lax here and say the knife broke later. So maybe when we say that, why is it necessarily the case that the knife broke with the end of the shechita of the first animal? Maybe the knife broke with the end of the shechita of the last animal, and it was kosher for every single animal. So why are you assuming that it broke? The knife broke on the bone of the spine of the neck of the first animal, and therefore every subsequent animal is puzzle. Dilma be'etzem demafreket dibatraita ifkam. Maybe it got damaged by hitting the bone of the last animal, and every single animal is kosher. So it's possible that according to Rav Yosef, if you went like Rav Chisda, everything would be kosher. And the fact that he made any of them treifa means he's going like Rav Huna. So we really don't know how far Rav Chisda would take this, right? Would Rav Chisda take this so far to assume that every animal is kosher until you've proven they're not, or just that the first one is kosher? So that is the halacha of Rav Yosef. Now, Amr le Rav Acha Brei de Rava the Rav Ashi. Now, Rav Acha Brei de Rava said to Rav Ashi, look, I want to give you an important tip, which should be obvious to everyone listening to this Gemara. Rav Kahana matzich b'dikuta ben kol chada v'chada. Rav Kahana made his slaughterer, his shochet, check the knife between every single animal, right? Which, of course, resolves all these problems, right? Because you check it before the first one, you then shecht an animal, check it again, right? Which, of course, would slow things down. If you're an empire and you're shechting 20,000 birds a day or whatever they do, right? That's a lot of checking. I cannot imagine they check between each one, but certainly for big animals, this seems like very good advice, right? Kiman, why is that going? That seems like Rav Huna. You're doing like Rav Huna because Rav Huna basically says that if you check and the knife is broken, the previous animal is puzzle. And basically, he's checking each time to say, did the animal I just checked okay? And then after number two, is the animal I just checked it okay? After number three, etc. Answers the not necessarily. It could be like Rav Chisda. And all Rav Chisda basically said is that because you checked the knife before the first one, right? The first one's kosher. So check the knife before the second one, so that if at the end of the day the knife is puzzle, you can at least say I checked it before the first and the second and the third and the fifth, and they're all kosher. So maybe it's the chshuri batraita. It's the later ones, right? So that meaning the ones that you did after the first one. Because again, if you, according to one, now Rashi doesn't love this because we just said that this is probably not the case. But according to one reading of Rav Chisda, right, as long as you check the knife before the first one's kosher, you have to assume the second one might be puzzle. But if you check the knife again before the second one, and then you checked it, and then you found it puzzle later, the second one will be kosher. And so, according to this reading in Rav Chisda, you check the knife in order to be machshir the future ones, not to be machshir the past ones. Says the Gemara, well, that's a big problem though, because if you're checking the knife for the future, that's where we said you're supposed to have bedikat chacham, right? You're supposed to not check your own knife. You're supposed to get an expert to look at your knife before you do shchita. So if we're like Rav Huna, you're looking at it for the past. You don't necessarily need a chacham. But if you're doing the knife check for the future, why don't you need a bedikat chacham? Says the Gemara, no. This whole question of bedikat chacham is totally extraneous. Because the truth is, Eid echad neman b'yisurin. You don't need a chacham to tell you that your food is kosher, right? In halacha, in Jewish law, one aid is enough. If a person says, I did it okay, you don't need a rabbi, you don't need hashgacha, you don't need anything like that. You just trust in Eid echad, which of course would make our lives a lot easier. But Eid echad is neman b'yisurin. And Rashi goes through where it's not, but most cases it is. So it's more, well, that's true, but then why do you need a chacham ever? Yachi meikar namilo. Why do you ever ask a chacham to check the knife? Says the Gemara, well, you missed the point. The chacham is done for social reasons. Hamar Rabbi Yochanan lo amru laharot sakin lechacham el pnei kvodo shel chacham. It's done out of respect. It's not done for any halachic reason. You don't need a rabbi's permission or a chacham's permission to do shchita. If a shochet says, I checked the knife was kosher, any person in their house says, I cooked dinner was kosher, you trust them. Eid echad neman b'yisurin, right? And so the only reason you have the chacham check the knife is because you want to show respect. But if you're doing it 10 times in a day, you don't have to have a chacham do it. And so basically what the advice is that you show the knife to the chacham in the beginning of the day, but then every time you shecht between every animal, check it again. And this potentially will save animals from becoming treif if at the end of the day you find the knife is pagum. So that is where we go. Again, the Gemara implies we pass like Rav Huna. Rashi certainly agrees that way. But the Gemara did say that if you broke bones with it, you go like Rav Chisda, and then you of course have to define what bones and how much that means and what the chazakah is. Now, that's the end of that.
This is we don't usually follow Rav Huna when he has a dispute with another Amora. So he wins this argument. That's unusual.
Well, so again, it's a Gemara really doesn't say that he wins the argument, right? Because if you read the Gemara, it says halachas like Rav Huna, if you didn't break any bones. Rav Huna, of course, said even if you broke bones all day long, it's still puzzle, right? So we're actually we're passing like the opinion of Rav Huna, but not like Rav Huna himself, because it does say we pass like Rav Chisda when you broke the bones. Again, like your point is correct that we often don't go like Rav Huna. This is a lot more complicated, and again, it's not so clear exactly how far you go with this if you keep on shechting more and more animals. But the Gemara here at least makes it sound like we only pass like Rav Huna if there's no more likely explanation, which is clearly not what he said, right? So it's not going like him literally. Rav Huna himself literally said, even if you break bones with it all day long, you still have a puzzle. And our Gemara disagrees with that. Now, the final thing we're going to do today, which is just a very general introduction, we're on halfway down of Yod Amabet, is take a step back and ask the Gemara, beautiful statement of the Gemara, is Minaha Milta Damur Rabbanan Uki Milta Cheskate, right? The whole premise of our Gemara yesterday and today was Rav Huna's statement that an animal that's alive is puzzle. And you have to know that's the chazaka of the animal. Until you change that, remember we had a lot of discussions about changing it with a knife and looking at other halachot, it doesn't change. How do you know that you care? Like, how do you know that precedent, that what happened in the past really matters, right? This whole concept of chazakah. Says Rav Shmuel bar Nachmani Amar Rabbi Yonatan, I have a very simple case in the Torah. Amar Kra, the pasuk talks about sarat, right? A Kohen walks into a house and a Kohen sees a nega on the wall. Remember that in order to be tzarat, something has to look a certain way, it has to be a certain size. The Kohen says, okay, this is the right size, this is the right thing. This house is now tzarat. But very interestingly, it doesn't say that the Kohen stands there and announces that the house is tzarat. What it says in the pasuk is, Amarkra, v'yatsa kohen min habayit, the Kohen walks out of the house, el petach habayit, to the doorway of the house, v'hiskirat habayit shivat yamim, and he then seals the house for 7 days, meaning that you don't announce that it's Sarat until you walk out of the house and stand outside the house. Says the Gemara, says Rishon Bar Nachmani, Dilma adinafik va'ati batzalei shira. How do you know that the thing that you saw on the wall of the house didn't change by the time you stepped out of the house? You took 3 minutes to walk out, or 30 seconds to walk out of the house. Maybe it's no longer a Sarat anymore. So clearly, what you're allowed to say is, look, I just saw it. It looked that way. I walked outside. I assume it's the same thing. You see from here that you don't have to literally see it. You can assume that it was that way 30 seconds ago. I walked out of the house. It's still that way. So you clearly see that you have a chazaka. Now, of course, you can question how long should that chazaka last? Should it last a day, a week, a month, 20 years, right? What if the Kohen goes home and takes a shower and goes to the store and then he says, okay, I forgot, I have to announce that house is tzarat. Can you do it a day later? Can you do it, so that's a good question, but clearly you can do it at some point when you're not literally looking at it because you can assume that what you saw a few minutes ago remains the case. And that's chazaka. Says Rav Acha bar Yaakov, that's not a great proof at all. Matkav Rav Acha bar Yaakov, maybe he walked out backwards. Maybe the Kohen never turned around. He's staring at it the whole way to the door. He watched the nega as he's walking out of the house. I'm like Abaye says Abaye to Rav Acha bar Yaakov, but that's ridiculous. Stay tshuva b'davar. You got two big problems with what you just said. Chada, that's not. It says you leave the house. Yitzia derech achura lo shma yitzia. Walking out backwards is not normal, right? It's not how people exit houses, especially if there are steps. So Yitzia derech achurav is not lo shma yitzia. And further, sure, let's say it's right there facing the doorway. You can watch it as you walk out. But what if it's in a place where you can't see? What if it's obscured by the door, right? So you can't walk out of the house and see it if the door is blocking your view or if it's around a corner. Says Gemara, well, maybe you got to open up windows. Maybe you'd have to keep visual sight line of the nega the whole way. And if you lose your visual sight, you have to open a window in the door that you can see through. Says the Gemara, but that's clearly not the case. That's not. We have a specific Mishnah in Negaim that says that you never make, changes in the house in order to see the nega. Meaning, the example in the Mishnah is Bait Afel. Let's say you have a dark house, and the Kohen comes to the house to look at the nega, and he says, there's not enough light. I can't tell whether this is a nega or not, right? Says the Mishnah, and it's based on a pasuk, Ein potchin bo chalanot lerot nigao. You don't bring in lights. You're not allowed to do that, right? You're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to bring in artificial light or solar light by opening a new window so that you can expose more light on it. If it's not able to be seen in its current state, it's not sarat. And so clearly you can't require a Kohen to make new doorways and lights into a house or window or cameras, as we would say nowadays, in order to see a nega. And so you basically, says Abaya, that's the proof that you don't have to literally see it to walk out of the house and then say, this house is tzarat, because you can assume that since you saw it 3 minutes ago and it was tzarat, it's still that case. Amalei Rava, now Rava, as we've had several times last few days, and Abaya obviously had a lot of disagreements, says Rava, Abaya, you're not very convincing either. What do you mean, Yitzia derech acharav lo shma Yitzia, right? It's Gahamar Yitzia derech acharav lo shma Yitzia. You say that walking out backwards is not called walking. That's not true. Kohen Gadol Yom Kippurim Yochiach, right? The Kohen Gadol Yom Kippur, everybody agrees. It says by the Kohen Gadol that you have to leave the Beit HaMikdash, the Kodesh Kadashim, the Chtei Yitzia. If it's not, we learned in the Mishnah in Yuma, Yatza Balo Derech Kinisato, that the Kohen goes into the Beit HaMikdash and leaves the same way he came in, meaning he walks out backwards. So says Rava, well, there's clearly a precedent for walking backwards. And again, you could see why Abaya would say that's a very unusual case. But that's Rava's first refutation of Abaya. The second is the Ka'amrit Bayit Afelim Potchim Bo Chalonot Lerot Nigo. You quoted me this Mishnah Nigaim that if you're in a dark house, we don't expect you to do renovations, right, and open up a window in order to see the nega. That might be true, but that's Hani Mila Hechad Lo Chazek. that's where you haven't established that it looks like tzarat. So you're going into the house to look at it, and your question is this a nega or not? And you say, I can't tell, I need more light. The Torah says you're supposed to take the house in its current state. You don't need more light. If you need more light, it's not a tzara, right? So that's true in that case. But in this case, says Rava, it may be very different. The Kohen walked into the house and he saw that it was tzarat. His only question is, will it remain that in the 3 minutes it takes me to walk out of the house? Maybe in that case, the Torah does require you to make a camera or put a window in so that you can see it all the way out. Maybe it's chazek. So, anyways, that was the statement of Rava and Abaya. And says Gemara, in fact, there's a brayta that supports Rav Acha bar Yaakov, right? Because remember, Rav Acha bar Yaakov's point was that maybe you walked backwards, right? So there's a brayta that supports Rav Acha bar Yaakov. Oh, sorry, that goes against Rav Acha bar Yaakov, right? Rav Acha bar Yaakov argued the proof of Rishon bar Nachmani Amar Rabbi Yonatan was that the Kohen doesn't literally have to see the nega when he announces that the house is tzara, and he can walk out of the house and then announce it. So you see, you rely on chazaka. Rav Acha bar Yaakov raised the possibility, and no, maybe the Kohen has to have a direct sight of the nega all the way till he announces that it's tzara. And Abaye didn't like it because he said, first of all, you'd have to walk out backwards, and B, you'd have to have a window so you could see it. Maybe that's so, and Rava didn't like that. But in fact, there's a brayta that goes against Rav Acha bar Yaakov, which implies that you don't literally have to see the nega when you announce that the house is tzarat. What does the brayta say? It quotes the pasuk. Pasuk says, "V'yatsa kohen min habayit." Right? The kohen goes out of the house. Yachol, you might have thought that means Yelech letoch beito v'yaskir. Maybe he goes to his house. Right? The Kohen leaves the house. Let's say he lives in Riverdale and he saw a house in New Rochelle. He goes home. He gets comfortable, and then he announces that it's tzarat. Tamlomer el petach habayit. No, don't go home. Right? Go to the entrance to the house that's being muskar for tzarat. He says the Braita, if it says petach habayit, you might think Yachol Yamod Tachat HaMashkof Yaskir. You might think that he can stand in the doorway, so he doesn't have to actually leave the house. He could stand in the doorway. Talmud Lomar min habayit. No, leave the entire house. Ad sheyetzei min habayit kulo. You have to leave the entire house. Haketzat. So what does the Kohen do? Omeid b'tzad HaMashkof Maskir. What he does is he stands outside of the doorway and he says, "This house is condemned, not condemned literally, but is muskar." And continues the bright. This is the question. But how do you know that if he doesn't do it properly, he rushes home? The Kohen goes home. He's got to pick up his kid from school. So he rushes home. Or he does the other thing. He stands inside the house that's condemned. And he's maskir. Now that's not so smart because he's going to become tamei once he does that. But let's say he does that. How do you know that bidi avad works? Cheskero muskar. In fact, that's okay as well. Talmud he's scared to bite. That even though it's not ideal to do it that way, it's okay to do it that way. But clearly, it says he can go home and stand in his house and announce that the house is tamei. How could he do that? According to Rav Acha bar Yaakov, you've got to have sight on the thing the whole time, right? So clearly, you see from this brayta that we can rely on chazaka, and that the fact is that the Kohen was there 5 minutes ago, 10 minutes ago, and he saw the nega, and he leaves the house. He can assume that the nega remains there, and he can say the house is tamei, even though at the moment he said the house is tamei, he's not literally seeing the nega inside the house. And that is our proof. But Rav Acha bar Yaakov will not give up. Because Rav Acha bar Yaakov says, I still think that the Braita doesn't argue with me, because Kigon, you always can have a case, Dekaimi Dara de Gavri. You can have a row of men standing, like a bucket brigade, V'amri, and they can say, Kid dekoi koi, it still looks the same way it looked before. And so it's true, maybe you have to go home. But you can get, 50 people standing in the house 3 feet away, 10 feet away, shouting out telephone to each other. And so, in fact, the Kohen can be certain that it still looks that way. And so, therefore, Rav Acha bar Yaakov does not give up. Now, of course, this is a little bit of a challenge, you can imagine, because the Kohen is the one who's supposed to see it, not the other people, right? So it's not like this really resolves the issue of the Kohen seeing it, but maybe that's where it's not chazaka, right? Chazaka is basically blind trust. Something was in its state. You have no idea if it's still there. Nothing changed it. You walk away and you assume it's the same thing. Maybe Rav Acha bar Yaakov is arguing You can't prove from here that you can rely on chazaka. You have to have more knowledge. In this case, it could be humans standing there and telling you what's going on. Of course, the Gemara does not, as you could tell, the Gemara does not like that and goes with this halacha that there is a chazaka. Tomorrow, at the second line, we're going to get to the next question of how you know you go after rov, which is the same sort of principle. So very interesting stuff. Hope everyone enjoyed, and we will continue tomorrow. Shavua tov.
Shavuot Tov, Yasher Koach.
Thank you.